Four innocent kids vanished during a peaceful school picnic in 1998. No trace, no suspects, until 6 chilling years later, a single discovery shattered everything we thought we knew. This isn't just a mystery. It's a descent into secrets buried deep beneath trust, memory, and time. Every minute brings a new revelation. Every twist more haunting than the last. Watch until the very end. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, real-life-inspired thrillers that'll keep you up at night. It happened on Friday, May 15th, 1998, in the small, wooded township of Crescent Hills, nestled on the edge of northern Michigan. School had just entered the last stretch before summer break, and the 5th grade class from Briar Glen Elementary was off on a much-anticipated picnic to Hollow Creek Preserve, a sprawling forested park famed for its ancient trees, winding hiking trails, and the slow, silent river that snaked through it. There were 32 students, 3 chaperones, and 2 teachers on that trip. The buses arrived at 10:04 a.m., parking in the gravel lot at the edge of the reserve. The sun was bright, the wind mild, and for the first hour or two, laughter echoed under the tall canopy of sycamores and pines. Blankets were spread on the open glade. Sandwiches were unwrapped. Children sprinted back and forth with frisbees and juice boxes. The 4 children who would later vanish. Emily Grant, Darren Holt, Sophie Morales, and Jacob Price. Were all 11 years old, all bright, healthy, a little mischievous, and inseparable. They had formed their own little group that year. Emily and Sophie were best friends since 1st grade. Jacob had moved to the area last fall and quickly bonded with Darren over a shared love of comic books. The 4 of them often sat together in class, always whispering and giggling, sometimes getting into mild trouble for not paying attention. Around 1:17 p.m., several groups of children broke off for a short, supervised hike up the Copper Ridge Trail, a narrow dirt path leading to a scenic overlook. The teachers agreed to stagger the groups. One would leave every 10 minutes, each with an adult chaperone. Emily, Darren, Sophie, and Jacob were scheduled for the 1:40 p.m. group with Mrs. Beckley, a soft-spoken substitute teacher and one of the trip supervisors. But when it was time to depart, the kids were nowhere in sight. At first, it was assumed they had just wandered off to the restroom or were playing in the thicket near the stream. Mrs. Beckley waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. She asked around. No one had seen the 4 since shortly after lunch. The first tinges of worry began creeping in. At 2:05 p.m., the teachers conducted a head count and confirmed it. The 4 children were gone. What followed next unfolded in a surreal blur. The adults split up, fanning out across the preserve, calling their names. Emily, Darren, Sophie, Jacob echoed endlessly, bouncing off tree trunks and vanishing into the dense hush of the woods. By 2:45 p.m., panic had replaced confusion. The park rangers were notified. The school principal, who hadn't joined the trip, was contacted. He, in turn, called the parents. By 3:12 p.m., the first of them, Meredith Grant, Emily's mother, arrived at the scene. She drove like a madwoman, her Honda screeching to a halt near the ranger station. She was pale, trembling, wearing mismatched shoes. She'd been at work when the call came and had left without grabbing her purse. Rosa Morales, Sophie's mother, came next. Then Russell Price, Jacob's father. Darren's father, Dean Holt, was last. He'd been out of range on a roofing job in the next county. When he finally got there just before sundown, his face was soaked with sweat, white around the eyes like someone hit with a shovel. The sun dipped low behind the trees. By nightfall, Briar Glen Elementary was on lockdown. Police had cordoned off the preserve. The local sheriff's department, aided by volunteers and canine units, began a massive grid search. Helicopters circled overhead with searchlights. Every inch of Hollow Creek Preserve was combed: trails, ravines, riverbanks. Campers in the area were questioned. Rangers were interrogated. Drones hadn't become standard yet, so the search relied on manpower, flashlights, and fading hope. But there was nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a scream, Not even a footprint. It was as if the forest had opened its lungs and breathed them in. By the second day, national news picked up the story. Asterisk, asterisk, 4 school children vanish without a trace. Asterisk, asterisk. Reporters camped outside the preserve gates. Cameras were shoved into grieving faces. A wall of missing posters lined every tree from the park to downtown Crescent Hills. People poured in from nearby towns to help. Candlelight vigils began springing up across Michigan, but none of it brought answers. On day 4, something was found. Not the children, but their backpacks. All 4. They were discovered by a hiker named Nancy Turner, nearly 9 miles northeast of Hollow Creek, near an abandoned ranger cabin that had been out of service since the 1970s. The bags were untouched, like someone had laid them gently side by side in the dirt. They were dry, unsoiled, and fully zipped. Emily's had her sketch pad, still inside. Darren's still had his inhaler. Sophie's was decorated in stickers. Jacob's had his Walkman, still loaded with batteries. But no fingerprints. No signs of struggle. Just eerie, deliberate placement. The area around the cabin was swept, and yet again there was nothing. No tire tracks. No footprints. No broken twigs. It was almost like the backpacks had materialized there. A week turned into 2, then into a month, then into a year. The 4 children remained missing. The toll it took on their families was unspeakable. Meredith Grant refused to leave her house for the first 6 months. Her husband had left her years earlier, and Emily had been her only child. She kept Emily's room exactly the same. Pillows untouched, favorite books stacked neatly. She'd stare at the doorway, as if expecting her to wander in any minute. She joined every search group, every parent-led investigation, and eventually sold her wedding ring to fund a private detective. Rosa Morales and her husband Luis began to unravel almost immediately. Luis drank. Rosa prayed. They blamed each other, blamed the school, blamed themselves. Their son, who was just 5 at the time, learned to sleep through shouting matches. A year later, Rosa packed a suitcase and disappeared from the family home without saying goodbye. Dean Holt, Darren's father, became something of a myth around town. He converted his entire garage into a wall-sized map of Hollow Creek and its surrounding region. Strings, thumbtacks, Polaroids, red markers. He hunted patterns, clues, wrote letters to newspapers, argued with cops. He kept a scanner radio running 24/7, convinced that one day he'd hear a code that meant Darren was alive. And Russell Price, the quietest of all, sued the school district and lost. Then he tried to sue the town and lost again. When that didn't work, he turned his grief into silence. He never spoke to reporters, never made a speech. He just sat on his porch every evening, staring down the road like he was waiting for a ghost to return. Over the next 6 years, the memory of the Hollow Creek faded from national attention. There were other headlines, other tragedies, but in Crescent Hills, the wound never closed. Not really. There were whispers of serial kidnappers, supernatural theories, cult activity, but no leads, no answers. And then, in April of 2004, everything changed. On a cold spring morning, just as the trees began to bud again, a maintenance crew was clearing out an old storm drain under the Route 27 bypass, about 12 miles from the original disappearance site. The tunnel had caved in years ago after a flood and was being excavated for repairs. One of the crew members found something lodged deep in the collapsed pipe. It was a handwritten note, sealed in a sandwich bag. The ink was smeared but legible. Inside were 4 names: Emily, Darren, Sophie, Jacob, asterisk, asterisk. And underneath, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters: "We didn't run away. He kept us. Please help." That was the day everything started to crack open. The handwriting was unsteady, childlike, and desperate. When the note was first handed to Detective Ella Rourke, now a senior officer in the case long presumed closed, she sat silent in her unlit office for a full 5 minutes, staring at it. She turned the plastic bag over and over in her hands, as if doing so might unravel some hidden message. She'd never believed they'd just vanished into thin air, but after 6 years and 1,000 dead ends, her belief had become little more than a private burden. And now this. The bag had been wedged behind an old rusted pipe fragment, nearly missed completely by the excavator. Ella called forensics. Within hours, the old case files were dusted off and pulled back from storage. The media, ravenous for the next miracle comeback, exploded with headlines. Hollow Creek 4. New hope emerges from the dark. The parents were notified that evening. Meredith Grant collapsed onto her knees when she read the words. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She clutched the plastic like a holy relic, like it might burn into her skin and take her to her daughter. Dean Holt punched a hole in the drywall of his hallway. Then he fell to the floor, sobbing so hard his lips turned blue. He hadn't cried in 4 years. Rosa Morales, who had been living in a small apartment above a laundromat 2 towns over, drove to Crescent Hills that very night. She hadn't seen Luis in almost 5 years. They met on the police station steps without a word. He just held her. Russell Price said nothing. He walked to the porch as he always did, sat down, and stared into the street. Only this time, with something in his hand, a copy of the note. Over the next week, the search resumed, but this time with sharper eyes. The storm drain where the note had been found was part of an old water system that had connected to several forgotten service tunnels beneath the county. Some were collapsed, others flooded. Many hadn't been explored in decades. Cadaver dogs were sent in. So were robotics, crawling camera units, wired for thermal and movement. But most of the passages were too narrow or too unstable. Maps from the 1960s were dug up from the city archives. A few sewer workers, old-timers, were brought in to share what they remembered. And then came the second clue. A set of 3 small handprints, dusty but distinct, pressed against the inside wall of one of the dry tunnels off Route 27. Forensic comparison with school fingerprint records, kept on file in 1998 after an ID program initiative, confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. The prints belonged to Emily, Darren, and Sophie. But not Jacob. Why not Jacob? Theories swirled. Maybe he'd been kept separately. Maybe he'd escaped. Maybe worse. But Ella didn't let it show. She poured herself into every square foot of Hollow Creek's underground. She lived in the tunnels for days at a time, sometimes only coming out for an hour of rest before plunging back into the darkness. A new tip line opened. Hundreds of calls flooded in. Most were junk, people chasing reward money, psychics rambling about symbols and tree bark. But one call, placed by an anonymous male using a scrambled number, gave Ella her next direction. Try the access hatch behind the red silo in West Cherrytown, the one they bricked over in '89. The call disconnected before she could trace it. No name, no voice match, but the silo existed, and it had indeed been sealed. Records confirmed a warehouse collapse in '89 led to the entire lower level being filled and blocked off. With the property now abandoned and condemned, the police moved fast. Sledgehammers, crowbars, jackhammers. The hatch was deeper than expected. 15 feet down was a rusted steel door. On the other side, a narrow brick tunnel leading into a wrought wooden staircase. The air was thick and moist, as if something had been breathing there for years. The team paused at the bottom of the stairs. A faint scratching echoed from somewhere far within the walls. Not animal, not wind, something else. A metallic clang, like a lock snapping into place. They followed the noise until they found it. Asterisk, asterisk, a chamber, asterisk, asterisk. Part of the original facility, a bomb shelter built during the Cold War, long buried and forgotten. Inside were cages, actual cages, welded together from iron fencing and rusted pipes. Each no larger than a child's closet. They were empty, but on the far wall, words had been scratched in with nails or wire. He kept us here. We waited. He promised to let us go. Liar. There were tally marks. Hundreds. Some overlapping. Beneath the words lay something else. A shoe. A child's sneaker. Red and frayed. It matched what Emily had been wearing the day she vanished. DNA swabs were taken. Photos. Everything bagged. And still, no children. No signs of life. But it was clear now. They had been here. This was where they were held. Possibly for years. But who had done it? And why? 2 days later, A breakthrough arrived in the form of a photograph, postmarked from Ontario, Canada, mailed anonymously to the local sheriff's office. In the faded, grainy image, 3 children seated around a small table, their faces partially obscured by dust and age, but recognizable. Emily, Darren, Sophie. They looked older, maybe 15, 16, tired, malnourished, but alive. No sign of Jacob. The photograph set off a firestorm. For the first time in 6 years, hope wasn't just a word, it was a possibility. The search widened beyond Michigan. Border Patrol was notified. Airports watched for clues. Tips poured in from across the country. Then a second photograph came. This one had a note taped to the back, scrawled in the same jagged writing. He's watching. We can't run yet. But soon. J asterisk asterisk. J. Jacob. He was alive. And he was helping them. The case was no longer a mystery of loss. It was a countdown. And whoever he was, he knew the clock was ticking. 6 years and 4 months after the children disappeared, the town of Merriwick had decayed into a shell of what it used to be. Businesses that once bustled on weekends were now boarded up. Lawns overgrew. Windows were dirty. You could walk the main street and feel like the town itself was in mourning. The case had long grown cold, frozen and filed away in some rusting cabinet at the county sheriff's office. Occasionally, a new detective would come by, flip through the dusty files, and make empty promises to the families before moving on to the next town, the next tragedy. But everything changed on a bitter February morning in 2005. It was a hunter who made the call. Darren Holtz, a retired Vietnam vet and lifelong resident of a nearby town called Oxbend. He had ventured into the backwoods near Briar Hollow, a heavily forested area located nearly 40 miles west of where the children had disappeared. Holtz was tracking a wounded buck when he stumbled onto something he almost didn't notice. A piece of yellow fabric, faded and frayed, stuck to a branch no higher than his knee. It looked like part of a child's raincoat. Curious, Holtz pushed deeper into the thicket. 20 feet in, he found the rest of the coat tangled beneath brush and moss, half-eaten by time. There were scratches on the fabric, not from claws, but sharp tools. Nearby, half buried under leaves, was a backpack. It was pink with cartoon animals, the kind you'd see in any department store in 1998. Inside, untouched by time, was a laminated class schedule, faded but legible. The name on the inside tag read, Ellen Mycroft, grade 3 ***. Within hours, the woods were swarming with local police and state forensic teams. News vans parked crookedly along dirt roads. Helicopters circled. Drones were deployed. Search teams combed the area, and what they found shook every corner of Merriwick to its foundation. Not far from Ellen's coat and backpack was a clearing with disturbed earth. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a small underground space, man-made, old, and shoddily constructed with wooden boards and rusty nails. It was barely large enough for 4 children. The authorities wouldn't tell the press what they found inside, but word leaked fast. Scratched into the wood were names. 4 names: Ellen, Marcus, Leo, and Serena. Each name was carved over and over, dozens of times, as if done by desperate, shaking hands. What haunted investigators the most was that each name had been followed by a tally. Vertical lines, some counted as high as 30, some more than 60. No one said it aloud, but the implications screamed louder than anything else. They were keeping count. Days? Attempts? Punishments? No one knew, or perhaps no one wanted to guess. No remains were found. No bodies. No bones. Just the imprint of a horror too detailed for the media to fully report. The discovery reignited everything. The parents were summoned again for interviews. Marla and Dean Mycroft stood in front of their garage door, trembling as they clutched the backpack now sealed in an evidence bag. Dean broke down first, screaming in the driveway as though 6 years of grief finally erupted from his bones. Marla stared blankly at the item, touching the plastic as if willing her daughter's scent to rise from it. Amanda Garvey, Serena's mother, didn't speak to reporters. She didn't speak to anyone. She checked herself into a psychiatric center 2 days after the discovery. Eric and Danny Parson, Leo's parents, moved back to Merriwick after years away, hoping to be closer to any new developments. They hadn't spoken since their divorce, but they stood side by side during a televised plea for more information. The town, too, was stirred awake. Locals swore they had always believed something darker was buried in the woods, beyond what anyone would admit. Theories reignited, old ones forgotten ones. Some said the kids had been abducted by a hermit. Others whispered about a cult that once operated deep in the forest, doing rituals in long-abandoned root cellars. There was even one man, a former Whitlow Reserve groundskeeper, who claimed he saw people in black robes walking into the forest that same night in 1998. He was dismissed back then, chalked up to being drunk. Now, he was being re-interviewed. In early March, just weeks after the new evidence surfaced, a woman came forward. Her name was Lorna Ashcroft. She had lived in Merriwick during the 90s and moved away just a year after the children vanished. She contacted the sheriff's office with a claim. Back in October of 1998, she had seen something strange on the day of the picnic. A white van parked on an old service road near the edge of the forest, far from the designated picnic areas. Inside the van, she saw a man smoking, watching the trail with binoculars. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. What startled detectives was her detail. She described a very specific tattoo on the man's neck, a skeletal bird wrapped in barbed wire. That symbol matched one listed in an old database tied to a fringe group known as the Order of Ashen Earth, a rural, underground cult disbanded in the early 90s following multiple arrests for ritual abuse and child endangerment. The group operated in the Tri-County area, exactly where the kids vanished. Lorna's memory cracked, opened the case further. A name emerged, Gideon Maris. He had once been an active member of the Ashen Earth group. Arrested in 1991, released in 1996. He vanished off the grid shortly after his parole. Some believed he had died. Others said he had gone deeper underground. What disturbed the task force most was a chilling record they found buried in sealed archives. A complaint filed in 1997, barely a year before the children vanished. A mother in a nearby town had reported seeing a man in a white van parked outside her daughter's school. The license plate matched one Gideon once owned. The complaint had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. The officer who filed it later left the force, citing burnout. His name? Sheriff Ray Elridge, the same man who led the original investigation into the kids' disappearance. Elridge, now retired and living 2 states away, was approached by the task force. When asked about the old report, he became tense. He said he had done everything by the book, but when pressed further, his story unraveled. He had known Gideon. In fact, they had grown up in the same county, attended the same school. They weren't friends, but Elridge admitted that after Gideon's parole, he had run into him once at a gas station just weeks before the children vanished. I didn't think it meant anything, Elridge told them. I thought he was long gone. I never connected it. But the silence in his voice said more than the words did. A subpoena was issued. Elridge's old files, phone records, and notes were examined. What they found horrified the team. A hidden notebook, tucked in the back of his personal filing cabinet, contained scribbled pages labeled with dates and initials. 4 sets of initials. AM, LP, SG, MK Kropka. Next to each were single words. Asterisk, obedient asterisk, resistant, quiet, panics, followed by tallies. Dozens of them. Some dates matched the alleged number of days the children had been missing before the search widened. Elridge was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to cover up child endangerment. In custody, he remained silent, only muttering one thing during a breakdown in his cell. They weren't supposed to live. He promised me it would be done quick. The case, once cold and rotting, had now cracked wide open. But the truth, the entire, unfiltered truth, remained just beyond reach. And somewhere out there, Gideon Maris was still missing. 6 years after the disappearance of Noah, Caleb, Maddie, and Tasha, the town of Merriwick had grown quiet about them. The posters had faded, the whispers had thinned, and even the most desperate of parents had fallen silent. but the scars hadn't healed. Grief in Merriwick was a slow, crawling thing, an uninvited tenant that had moved into every home and refused to leave. In the Dawson house, Carla still left Noah's bedroom untouched. The superhero bedsheets were still tightly tucked. His favorite plastic dinosaur still sat perched on the windowsill. She dusted it weakly, barely breathing as she stepped inside. She would sit on the edge of his bed sometimes, fingering the edges of his pillowcase, as if waiting for him to walk in and scold her for going through his things. Her husband, Peter, no longer joined her. He had built a wall of silence around his grief, burying himself in work, home repairs, church duties, anything to keep his hands moving, anything to avoid looking into Carla's eyes and seeing the sea of unanswered questions. Then, on January 7th, 2005, something shifted. It began with a snowstorm, the kind that creeps in with eerie stillness. No wind, no warning. The sky turned the color of wet cement, and flurries started to fall in slow, methodical spirals. By dusk, the town had been buried under 9 inches of snow. Roads were closed. Power lines sagged with ice. And in that strange hush, the town waited. It was the next morning when a hiker named Mason Caro made a discovery that turned everything upside down. Mason had taken to snowshoeing in the hills east of Dunhill Hollow, a region known more for hunters and occasional bear sightings than hikers. He had a military past, a fondness for isolation, and little use for townsfolk. But he knew the land. He knew the trails. And when his snowshoe crunched against something solid and unyielding beneath the snow, he stopped and crouched. Brushing away the snow, he found a hatch. Metal, rusted at the edges, half buried in earth and overgrowth, likely missed by decades of forest expansion. He stared at it for a long time, heart suddenly pounding. There was no reason for a hatch to be here. No military outposts. No known bunkers. Just trees, hills, and silence. Mason called it in. By that afternoon, the area was swarmed with state troopers, forest rangers, and a newly energized detective, Ethan Granger, who hadn't stopped carrying the children's file in his glove compartment for 6 years. The hatch was unsealed. Inside, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. Moisture clung to the walls. The smell was metallic and musty, like wet copper and rotting wood. The team descended with flashlights, stepping carefully. The corridor widened into a chamber. Concrete, reinforced, abandoned but not ruined. Then, one by one, they found them. Not the children. Artifacts. For small backpacks. Moldy, weathered, but unmistakable. One had Maddie's initials etched in fading glitter paint. Another had a broken zipper, a detail only Carla Dawson would recognize instantly. And then the walls. Drawings. Crude, desperate sketches, children's drawings, covering every inch of concrete. Crayon, charcoal, whatever they had found. Figures with wide eyes. Stick figure families. Trees. A house with no windows. A large figure with no face, just lines where a mouth should be. Some of the drawings had dates. The last one was dated October 12, 2002. That was nearly 4 years after the kids vanished, which meant they had still been alive. For years. Alive and here. The town exploded in a frenzy. News vans returned. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office. Parents were summoned and re-questioned. Carla nearly collapsed when she saw Maddie's backpack. Her hands shook so badly she had to be sedated. John and Sarah Bellinger flew in from Canada, where they had moved in 2001 in an attempt to outrun their nightmares. They returned only to find the past waiting for them with claws. Detective Granger, now gray at the temples and on the verge of retirement, reopened the case with a fury. This time, the state brought in behavioral analysts, forensic teams, even a profiler from Quantico. What they discovered next broke open a truth far more horrifying than any of them could have imagined. Inside the bunker, behind a false wall, they discovered a small, blackened trunk. Inside were dozens of VHS tapes, meticulously labeled. The oldest dated back to September 1998. The last was October 10, 2002. The contents of those tapes would never be released to the public. But investigators confirmed one thing. The children had been held captive. Not tortured, not starved, but imprisoned, kept in that underground place like ghosts, never to see the light of day. Then they were gone. No footage of them leaving. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No oblivious. Just disappearance again. How they escaped, or where they were taken, was still a mystery. But the tapes showed faces. One of them was immediately familiar to law enforcement. A man named Travis Lorne. He had been a custodian at Merriwick Elementary in 1998. Fired quietly in October that year for what was then referred to as disciplinary misconduct. It was never made public. No one had thought to link him to the missing children. He had vanished from the town a week after their disappearance. Granger ordered a nationwide manhunt. But Travis Lorne had left no paper trail, no bank accounts, no phone records, nothing, until 3 weeks later, a call came in from a rural town in West Virginia. A local librarian had spotted a man matching Travis's description entering her library and using the computer terminal. She had found it odd. He seemed paranoid, looking over his shoulder constantly. He'd left behind a library card he wasn't supposed to have. A state-issued card, not from her town. The sheriff's department obtained security footage. It was grainy, but unmistakable. Travis Lorne. And he wasn't alone. He had been with a teenage girl. Slender, pale, dark eyes, and around her wrist, a tattered pink bracelet with a tiny silver M on it. Detective Granger nearly dropped the phone when he heard that detail. Maddie, she was alive, or someone wearing her bracelet was. A task force was deployed to West Virginia, and by the time they arrived, the library was closed. Travis Lorne had fled, but that night, a call came to Merriwick PD. It was a woman's voice. She didn't say her name, but she said one thing that no one could explain. I remember the taste of the crayons. We used to eat them when we were scared. Maddie said the red ones were strawberry, but they weren't. They tasted like dust. Then she hung up. The number was traced to a payphone just outside of Logan County, West Virginia. They arrived 20 minutes later. The phone booth was empty. On the ground, a crumpled piece of paper. A drawing. A stick figure of a girl standing beneath a tree with no leaves. And in the corner, in scribbled letters, the word, "Still here." By the time autumn returned to Merriwick in 2005, the town had almost folded back into its familiar rhythm. The unspeakable had become part of the air people breathe. Something tragic, yes, but no longer a fresh wound. Life, in its stubborn way, pressed on. But underneath the brittle calm, something festered. And the reappearance of the 4 missing children after 6 long years, disheveled, eerily quiet, and seemingly untouched by time, had shattered whatever illusions of healing the town had fostered. No one could explain how the kids had aged barely at all. Doctors were baffled. Psychological experts came and went. Theories ranged from underground captivity to mass hallucination. But the children refused to speak about anything. Not about where they'd been. Not about what had happened. Not even their names at first. Detective Eli Granger, who had retired in 2003 after suffering a mild stroke and an enduring loss of faith in his profession, was called back in an unofficial capacity. His instincts were too sharp, his history with the case too intertwined to ignore. And when he saw the children, Anna, Kyle, Lily, and Sam, sitting on cots under the dim hospital lights, his blood ran cold. "They haven't changed," he whispered. "Not a wrinkle, not a scar, not even taller." Dr. Harish Mehra, a neurologist from Boston brought in to examine the children, noted that their brain scans resembled those of children newly entering adolescence, despite having disappeared at age 8 and returning at what should have been 14. Their voices were still young. Their mannerisms were childlike. The only thing that seemed to have aged was their silence. It was ancient, but things grew stranger. Lily began to scratch at her arms in the middle of the night, muttering under her breath. Kyle drew circles obsessively, overlapping spirals in black crayon that filled entire walls. Sam refused to look at mirrors. Anna sat for hours facing corners of rooms, mumbling syllables that didn't match any known language. Then, 3 weeks after their return, A fire consumed the home of their social worker, Karen Dillinger. Her body was found in the bathtub, melted phone still clutched in her hand. The children were moved to a secure facility, but the oddities continued. Lights flickered in their presence. CCTV footage from their rooms often turned to static. A nurse went missing one night during a routine check. Only her shoes were found, still warm, standing neatly at the threshold of the ward hallway. Eli began to wonder if what had come back were even the same children at all. He started revisiting old witness statements, including a local farmer, Lester Keene, who'd mentioned strange lights in the woods the night the children vanished. In 1998, he'd been laughed off the investigation for saying he saw the forest open its eyes. But Eli was no longer laughing. The drawings that Kyle created were examined by a semiotics professor at a nearby college. She noted that many of the symbols matched those used in archaic, pre-human cave paintings found in remote parts of Asia and Africa. This spiral, she said, pointing to the thickest of Kyle's crayon marks, appears in Mesopotamian tablets as a symbol of entrance through stillness, a kind of doorway. Then, without warning, Sam spoke. It was barely audible, whispered to the nurse who'd been with him longest. Just 4 words. He's still out there. When asked to elaborate, Sam fell into a seizure so violent he cracked a tooth. The incident was kept quiet, but Eli learned of it through a connection at the hospital and begged to speak with the boy. After 2 hours of sitting silently in a whitewashed interview room, Sam looked up with eyes that didn't match the old photos Eli had seen, darker somehow deeper, and said, "He never lets us go. He only lets us pretend." Eli felt the hair rise on his neck. "Who is he, Sam?" Sam's lips barely moved. "The man in the quiet." A long pause. "He took us through the tree. It wasn't a tree. It only looked like one. But inside was wrong. The air tasted wrong. The sky bled upwards." It was then that Eli began to sleep with a light on. Meanwhile, the town began to suffer in subtler ways. Electrical grids failed without cause. Wildlife behaved oddly. Flocks of birds circled overhead without moving on. Coyotes wandered downtown streets in daylight. People began to leave. A rumor had taken root that the children were not what they seemed. And then Lily vanished. Not escaped, vanished. One moment she was there in her hospital bed. The next, only her hospital gown remained, neatly folded, a spiral drawn on the sheet beneath it. The remaining 3 children didn't react. Kyle didn't look up. Anna didn't blink. Sam simply whispered, "He's here again." The town of Merriwick began to feel like a sinking ship. Windows cracked without impact. Trees bent away from the forest edge, as though recoiling. Eli, now increasingly haunted by dreams of spirals and soft murmurs behind walls, decided to revisit Whitlow Creek Reserve. He returned alone, carrying nothing but a flashlight, a notebook, and his badge. The trees, somehow taller than he remembered, loomed like sentinels. Wind didn't seem to move the leaves. The air felt thick, like walking through someone else's breath. And deep within the woods, he found it. Not the same spot the children were last seen, but something adjacent, something hidden. A small clearing where every tree grew in a perfect spiral pattern around a moss-covered stump. On the stump was a child's shoe, dusty, preserved, untouched by time. Next to it, a drawing, another spiral, but this one was bleeding. Eli reached for it, and behind him, something exhaled. He turned. No one was there, but the forest had eyes, and they were open. When the sun rose on the morning of September 19th, 2006, it cast a pale light over the mist-drenched trees behind the old Whitlow Creek Reserve. The forest looked unchanged, as though time had ignored it entirely. But everything else had changed. Merriwick was no longer the quiet town it once was. It bore the scars of loss. Homes left empty, marriages dissolved, friendships soured, and parents still living in a cycle of grief and haunted hope. Something new had begun to stir the ashes of the past. In the weeks following the disturbing footage discovered in the burned-out cabin, forensic teams returned to the woods in full force. But this time, they weren't alone. David Lantham had insisted on joining. He was no longer the man who stood at press conferences in a crumpled shirt, begging for his daughter to come home. He was harder now, quieter, always observing, always listening. He kept the video frame in his pocket at all times. Kayla's face, distorted and trembling in fear, her name on her lips as if she were about to cry out to him. By the second week of renewed investigation, cadaver dogs picked up a scent deep in the southern ridge. What they found was a partial bunker, hidden beneath a rotting trapdoor covered in moss. The entrance had collapsed in on itself years ago, likely from the same fire that had scorched the cabin. But below, buried in darkness, were signs of human life. Old clothing, a torn backpack with Casey's name tag still faintly legible, hand-drawn maps on scrap paper, documenting paths through the forest with strange markings, XS and circles, in areas that didn't exist on official maps. And then a door, metal, rusted shut. It took hours with tools and effort to pry it open. The air behind it was stale and thick. Lights flickered on, illuminating a narrow corridor that led into what could only be described as an underground compound. It wasn't large, maybe 4 or 5 rooms, but it was well constructed. Steel walls, reinforced locks, and everything inside had been abandoned in a hurry. The deepest room held the most disturbing discovery. A wall completely covered in photographs of the children. Not just from the picnic. Some of the photos were taken before 1998. Snapshots of Kayla outside her ballet class. Casey in a Halloween costume. Logan at a grocery store with his mother. And Owen riding his bike just blocks from home. Someone had been watching them for a long, long time. There were journals, too. Dozens of them. Most entries were cryptic, written in a shaky, almost frantic hand. But the pattern was clear. Whoever this was believed the children were chosen, that they possessed something that could be activated through isolation and observation. The ramblings hinted at some twisted belief system, a fusion of science and mysticism, suggesting the abductor wasn't working alone. Among the files recovered was a name, Dr. Samuel Rourke. A former neuropsychologist turned fringe theorist, Rourke had disappeared from public records in the early 90s after being fired from a prestigious university for unethical experimentation. His specialty had been the study of isolation on developing minds. Deep dives into paranoia, trauma, and the manipulation of memory. He believed the mind could be fractured and remade, like reshaping glass under fire. It was now theorized that he had recruited followers, disillusioned academics, fringe cultists, off-grid survivalists, and formed a hidden commune in the wilderness. The cabin, the bunker, the maps, they were all pieces of something much bigger. But where were the children? Media exploded again. Merriwick was swarmed with reporters. A new task force was assembled, led by seasoned federal agents with backgrounds in cult crimes and domestic terrorism. Every inch of the reserve and surrounding forest were scanned again, then mapped with drones and thermal imaging. And on October 6th, almost 8 years to the day since the children vanished, a heat signature was detected deep in an uncharted gorge, 15 miles from the original site. What they found changed everything. A single-story cabin, camouflaged under thick canopy. No road, no trail, no signs of power or plumbing. And inside for sleeping bags, for toothbrushes, for metal plates stacked in a corner, and 4 children. Except they weren't children anymore. The rescue team breached just before dawn. Inside, they found Kayla, Casey, Logan, and Owen alive. Malnourished, heavily disoriented, but alive. The scene was unlike anything law enforcement had ever encountered. The kids were silent at first, avoiding eye contact, flinching at every movement. They had been conditioned, trained not to speak. Owen, the youngest, was the first to whisper something. He called David Lantham's name. Then he collapsed into sobs. They were flown to a secure trauma center in Cincinnati. The FBI, child psychologists, and a dedicated rehabilitation team were assigned to begin unraveling what had happened. But it wouldn't be easy. The 4 children had been missing for nearly a decade. They had grown up in darkness, physically alive, but emotionally locked in a world of terror and control. It became clear early on that they had been moved multiple times between bunkers, remote safe houses, possibly even across state lines. There were hints of others, possibly more children, but the details were fragmented, shattered across 4 broken psyches. All 4 remembered the early days of their captivity vividly. The faces of the first 2 captors, the fear of the locked room, the lessons they were taught, obedience, silence, loyalty to the doctor. Kayla remembered most clearly. She had kept track of the days by marking tallies with her fingernails on the walls of each location. She estimated they had been moved at least 6 times. Always at night. Always drugged beforehand. She remembered being told her parents were dead, that they had abandoned her, that the world outside was poisoned. The lies were constant. The abuse was measured. Not always physical, but psychological, methodical. Designed to erase the old world, to instill a new reality. The public reeled. The nation wept. But no one was ready for what came next. On November 2nd, a former Merriwick resident named Kayla Voss was arrested at a gas station in Kentucky after trying to flee a traffic stop. His ID flagged a national alert connected to the Rourke investigation. In custody, he cracked quickly. Caleb had once been a volunteer at Whitlow Creek Reserve in 1998. He'd worked closely with Dr. Rourke and confessed to helping him select the children. He described the operation in disturbing detail, how the group targeted children who showed signs of independence, creativity, and emotional resilience. "We didn't want the weak," he said. "We wanted the ones who'd survive, who'd evolve." Caleb led the FBI to another compound in Tennessee, long abandoned, but containing more journals, more surveillance photos, and most chillingly, a list of names. Some had been crossed out. Others, including Kayla, Casey, Logan, and Owen, had dates written beside them. October 16th, 1998. But there were more names. Unfamiliar names. The scope widened. Investigators believed that Merriwick wasn't the only town. That Rourke's experiment had spanned across states. Possibly dozens of children had been taken over the years, never reported because they were isolated, off the grid, forgotten by broken systems. Rourke himself remained a ghost. No confirmed sightings. No fingerprints. No DNA. Like a shadow that moved through the cracks of the world and vanished. Back in Merriwick, the reunion of parents and children was not the tearful celebration many had dreamed of. It was raw, painful, awkward. There were long silences, attempts at hugs that didn't land, conversations that didn't go beyond single words. "How do you raise a child that never really grew up?" asked Michelle Harper in an interview. They left at 10. They came back at 18, but not really. They're trapped somewhere in between. Therapists called it layered trauma. Decades of work ahead. But there was hope. Kayla began to draw again. Owen laughed one day, watching a squirrel outside the window. Logan asked to see his old baseball glove. Casey slept through the night, without waking up screaming. For now, that was enough. But beneath the surface, the darkness still lingered. The journals had mentioned something about the next phase, and a final chilling phrase found etched into the back of a closet wall in the Tennessee compound. "The chosen remember, and they will return." In late February, Owen began to scream in his sleep. Not cry, not whimper. Scream, the kind that makes grown men stumble in their hallway. Legs unsteady, heart thudding as if they were hearing their own child being dragged through hell. Laura, his mother, had taken to sleeping outside his door on a cot. Every time Owen screamed, she rushed in, held him close, soothed his hair, and whispered the lie they had all agreed to repeat. "You're safe now. You're home. It's over." But it wasn't, and they all knew it. The other 3 children, now all between 15 and 16, showed the same signs. Logan stood for hours at his window, watching the tree line behind their house, whispering numbers under his breath. Casey began to mimic people, repeating their words in the same tone they used, as if she was learning how to be human again. And Kayla stopped speaking altogether for 2 weeks, communicating only through symbols on napkins and scrap paper. One morning, she slipped her mother a folded sheet of notebook paper with a single sentence. "He is in the static." The doctors dismissed it as disassociation, but the parents, especially Jack and Michelle, no longer trusted the experts. They were watching their children slip through the cracks of normalcy, being swallowed again by something none of them could see or name. By early March, another twist shattered what remained of their peace. Sheriff Ridley, who had quietly been working with an independent investigator from out of state, received a package at the station. It had no return address. Inside was a mini DV tape, a model not manufactured after 2000, and a note that read simply, "Asterisk, you were warned." Now ask what they saw. Asterisk, Ridley, along with the investigator, a retired FBI profiler named Malcolm Ardrey, watched the tape in a secure room. The footage was grainy, warped in places, but unmistakable. The timestamp read November 11th, 1998, just weeks after the children vanished. The camera panned through the dense woods, moving as if held by someone out of breath. Then came a clearing, and in the center, 4 children. They were naked, facing outward in a circle, as if protecting something in the middle. But when the camera zoomed closer, there was no object, only a black mark burned into the soil. The children's eyes were open but unfocused. Their mouths moved, whispering a single phrase over and over. Malcolm paused the tape and played the audio at a slower speed. The children were saying, "Asterisk, the door is thin. The door is thin. The door is thin. Asterisk." And then, just before the tape cut to static, something emerged in the background. A figure, tall, pale, draped in what looked like funeral cloth. Its face blurred, as if the lens couldn't hold on to it. And it wasn't walking. It floated. But there was movement, unmistakable. Malcolm turned to Ridley and whispered, "That's not a person." When they confronted the families with the tape, none of the parents took it well. Michelle collapsed. Ron punched a wall and broke 2 knuckles. Laura demanded answers, screaming until her throat gave out. But it was Jack who said what no one else dared to voice aloud. What if they didn't just vanish into the woods? What if they were taken somewhere else? That night, the 4 families convened in Laura and Ron's basement. No police, no reporters, just the 8 of them. A bottle of whiskey passed between trembling hands and the knowledge that they were all spiraling into something they no longer understood. They went over everything they had. Notes, photocopies, maps, journal entries, therapist reports, sketches from the children. Even rumors passed through town. One name kept resurfacing. Miller's Gap, asterisk asterisk, an abandoned coal tunnel system that had collapsed in 1949, killing 13 miners. It had long been closed off by the state, but over the years, teenagers had turned it into a rite of passage. Some swore it was haunted. Others claimed the tunnels went deeper than maps suggested. A few had disappeared over the years, always chalked up to accidents or runaways. But what caught Jack's attention was something else. In Kayla's notebook, one of the pages filled with symbols. She had drawn a spiral with a single word scrawled at the bottom. Gap. They had to see it for themselves. On March 19th, 2007, with snow still melting in patches across the wooded hills, Jack, Michelle, Ron, Laura, and Malcolm Ardrey hiked to Miller's Gap under cover of night. Ridley knew but didn't join them. He gave them a police radio and said, "If anything happens, call it in. But for the love of God, don't go deeper than the gate." They didn't listen. The entrance was rusted, the steel gate mangled from time and vandals. But beyond it, the tunnels still yawned open, swallowing their flashlight beams in oppressive darkness. The group advanced in a tight cluster, the air thick with the stench of earth, old water, and something metallic. They walked for 30 minutes before finding the first sign. A torn backpack strap, faded red. Logan's, stuffed inside a crevice. Then, further in, a child's shoe. Casey's brand, weather-worn. And then, the wall carvings. Symbols like the ones in the kids' notebooks, etched deep into stone. Spirals, arrows, eyes, circles broken by jagged lines. And something else. A mural-like section where 4 stick-figure children stood around a dark mass. Above them, etched in spidery lettering. When the hollow sings, the door will open. Laura broke down. Ron had to hold her upright as Michelle vomited in a corner. They should have turned back, but they didn't. Instead, they reached the echo chamber, a vast section of tunnel where the acoustics created unnatural reverberations. There, on the far wall, they found a hole. It looked too perfect to be natural, too circular, too smooth. The wind seemed to blow out of it, though they were deep underground. And then the whispers started. Not in their heads, not imagined, real voices. High-pitched, familiar. Jack dropped to his knees. "That's Kayla." Michelle nodded, pale as death. "She's singing the lullaby I used to." The air shifted. The lights dimmed. Malcolm raised his voice. "We need to leave. Now." As they turned, Ron froze. On the opposite end of the chamber, a shape had appeared. A person, no, a thing tall, humanoid, wrapped in fabric that seemed to float around it despite the still air. Its head twitched, and then it stepped forward. Jack pulled Michelle by the arm. "Go. Run." They did. Through the tunnels, retracing their steps by memory and panic, they fled. But the thing followed. They heard it. The soft scrape of limbs. The breathing that wasn't breath. The hum. The same tone the kids had described in their sleep. By some miracle, they made it to the surface. As they collapsed near the tree-line, panting, broken, soaked in sweat, Malcolm turned back. Nothing followed them out. But the door, he realized, hadn't closed. It had just let them go. 2 weeks later, Kayla began to speak again. Logan stopped staring at the trees. Casey resumed full sentences. Owen, though still troubled, no longer screamed at night. It was as if whatever was tethering them to the darkness had been weakened. But something else came with it. Each of the children began to draw again. This time not spirals, not monsters. Maps. Intricate maps of tunnels. Chambers. Underground paths. All identical. All leading to a central room with a single word beneath it. Nest. Jack and the others knew what it meant. Whatever they had found wasn't done. It had been watching. And now it knew they had seen it. The night of March 3rd, 2007, arrived with a silence too perfect to trust. No wind stirred the trees that lined the lake behind the recovery house. No rustle of wildlife. No sounds of water lapping against the dock. Just the soft hum of distant power lines and the fragile heartbeat of the house's occupants, all sleeping or pretending to. Kayla lay awake in bed, eyes wide open, not blinking. The moonlight cast pale bars across her ceiling. She didn't move, not even when she heard the floor creak just outside her room. She didn't need to check. She knew it was Logan. He walked the halls most nights now. The doctors said it was a coping mechanism. The therapist called it integration anxiety. But she knew better. Logan wasn't coping. He was remembering. Down the hallway, in the room closest to the attic stair, Logan stopped beside a vent and crouched low. It wasn't a noise that had drawn him there. It was a smell, copper and dirt, and something older. He pressed his fingers into the wood grain, gently pried, loosed the corner of the vent plate, and pulled it open. Behind it, folded like an animal nest, was a wad of clothing, old, rotted, stuffed deep into the ductwork. Children's clothes. His clothes. From the day they vanished. Blood on the sleeves. At the same moment, Owen sat bolt upright in his room, eyes unfocused, whispering something to no one. Casey was already awake. She hadn't slept in 3 days, tormented by visions of the stone corridor, the one deep beneath the farmhouse, where the walls wept salt and the air buzzed with the sound of 1,000 whispers. She had drawn it repeatedly. The therapist had taken her sketches away, burned them, but she kept drawing with anything she could find, eyeliner, coffee, even her fingernails against the drywall. Downstairs, Dr. Evelyn Maris sat reviewing patient files at the kitchen table. Her cup of tea had long gone cold. She didn't notice when the lights flickered. She barely looked up when the security camera feed glitched and blacked out for several seconds. Only when the main hallway monitor showed Logan standing perfectly still at the end of the corridor, staring directly into the lens, did she stand heart pounding. Outside, in a van parked along the tree line, Agent Morris watched the same feed. He grabbed his radio. "Base, we got a situation. Child is out of bed. Appears conscious, but something's wrong." Before the dispatch could respond, all 4 children walked into the main hallway together. They hadn't coordinated. They hadn't spoken. Yet they moved in eerie synchrony, as if summoned by the same frequency. The lights cut out completely. Inside the house, backup systems fail one by one. A foul, ancient smell wafted through the vents. The air turned colder, damper. Dr. Maris reached for the emergency flashlight just as every window in the house cracked outward with a sharp, glassy scream. By the time agents rushed in with floodlights and weapons drawn, the children were standing in the middle of the living room, facing the fireplace. There was something in the hearth. Burnt remains of fabric, charcoal, bone fragments. Kayla's voice broke the silence. Calm, low, and toneless. We weren't the first. Owen added, and we won't be the last. Casey lifted her hand and pointed at a dark spot behind the bookshelves, a hidden latch. Logan walked toward it and pulled it open without hesitation. Behind the wall, a staircase spiraled down into pitch blackness. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the unmistakable scent of wet stone and earth rolled up the stairs. No one wanted to descend, but the children did. What they uncovered beneath that house wasn't simply a forgotten cellar. It was a continuation, a replica of what lay beneath the farmhouse they'd been held in 6 years ago. But deeper, older, more elaborate. Rooms carved from stone. Symbols on the walls not found in any known language. Rusted surgical tools. Audio tapes with numbers etched into them instead of labels. Old photographs of other children. Dozens of them. Some taken in the 1950s. Others more recent. None of those children had ever been reported missing. One file, retrieved from a sealed cabinet, changed everything. It was a ledger, handwritten, yellowed with time. Names, ages, locations, dates. Each entry paired with a column marked simply returned. Some said yes. Most said no. Beside Logan's name, the entry read, Observe for cycle. Response advanced. Return delayed by 4 months. Kayla's read, Unbroken. Curious. Receptive. Return initiated upon trigger. Casey, compliant. May resist memory restoration. Long-term evaluation needed. Owen, detached. Has heard them. Dangerous. No last names. No mention of who was writing the entries. Another page was filled with symbols, identical to those carved into the farmhouse basement. One of the symbols matched the scar behind Logan's left ear. The agents removed every file, every artifact. The recovery house was shut down within 72 hours. The children were relocated once more, destination classified, even to their families. A second federal task force was assembled, this time involving international intelligence. They concluded that the organization behind the children's abductions was far larger than anyone imagined. A network spanning decades. Not a cult, not a trafficking ring, something more esoteric. Psychological experimentation blended with ancient ritualism, conducted on children because of their malleable minds, their ability to see what adults dismissed. The town of Merriwick fell silent again. The parents never received full answers. Each family was offered relocation, therapy, and compensation. But it wasn't enough. Some accepted, some stayed, some spiraled into isolation. The trauma didn't end with the return of their children. It simply evolved. 1 year after the truth began to unravel, a new family moved into the old farmhouse where the children had been held. Realtors had removed every trace of its history. New walls, fresh paint, polished floors. The family had 5 children. On their 3rd night, the youngest woke up screaming, said she'd seen the girl with no eyes at the end of her bed. The next day, the family moved out. The farmhouse has been vacant since. But lights are seen sometimes, flickering from the cellar windows. Faint voices rise from the earth. And occasionally, hikers report finding perfectly preserved children's shoes, lined in a row, pointed toward the trees. Each pair accompanied by a note, folded under the laces. Each note bearing a name. Some of those names are still missing. Some were never reported missing at all.